I have no doubt that if you're Australian as I am, or even if you're not, that you've heard of the chivalrous exploits of Ned Kelly and his gang. These actions have long been immortalised in Australian folklore, but were Ned Kelly and his ragtag group of bushrangers really the Robin Hoods of Australia? Or just some thieves who used that idea as a way to better their reputation among the common folk? Well, in this video, and its subsequent part 2, I hope to answer that very question as we dive into the incredible life of Ned Kelly. Ned Kelly's father, John, was born in 1820 at Clonbrogan near Moylegas in Count Tipperary, Ireland. At the age of 21, he was found guilty of stealing 2 pigs and was transported to Australia on the prison ship the Prince Regent. He arrived at Hobart on the 2nd of January 1842, and after finishing his sentence in January 1848, he moved to the colony of Victoria and found work at James Quinn's farm at Wallen Wallen as a bush carpenter. On the 18th of November 1850, John Kelly, sometimes known as Red, married Ned's mother, Ellen Quinn, who was just 18 at the time. After their marriage, the couple turned their attention to gold digging, which was very popular during that time in Australia, and managed to earn enough money to buy a small freehold in Beveridge just north of modern-day Melbourne. Ned Kelly was his parents' 3rd child, and while his exact birth date is unknown, it was probably sometime in December 1854. Ned was possibly baptised by an Augustinian priest, Charles O'Hee, who actually ended up being the one to administer Ned's last rites before his later execution. Unfortunately for Ned Kelly and his family, they did not prosper at Beveridge, and his father began drinking heavily. Following these hardships, in 1864, the family moved to Avenel, near Seymour, where, due to their sketchy activities, to say the least, they soon attracted the attention of the local police. As a boy, Kelly obtained basic schooling and became familiar with the surrounding bush. In Avenel, at the age of 11, he risked his life to save another boy from drowning in Hughes Creek. As a token of appreciation, the boy's family gave him a green sash, which he still wore all those years later under his armour during his famous final showdown with the police in 1880, which we'll cover in part 2. This sash can now be found at the Benalla Museum, still stained with his blood. In 1865, Ned Kelly's father was convicted in relation to the theft of a calf and sentenced to a fine of £25 or 6 months hard labour. Although the family couldn't afford to pay the fine, there is no record of Red being transferred to Kilmore Jail. In December 1866, Red was fined for being drunk and disorderly, which was unfortunately not much of a wake-up call for him as he continued his alcoholism before dying at Avenel on the 27th of December 1866. After their father's death, the following year, the Kellys moved to Greta in northeastern Victoria near the Quinn family and their relatives by marriage, the Lloyds. In 1868, the family leased a small farm of 88 acres or 360,000 square miles at 11 Mile Creek near Greta. Unfortunately, this land was likely unsuitable for successful farming, and Ned's mother, Ellen, supplemented her income by offering accommodation to travellers and illegally selling alcohol. In 1869, at the age of just 14, Ned Kelly met the Irish-born Harry Power, which was actually an alias for the man's real name of Henry Johnson. Harry Power, or Henry Johnson, was a transported convict who turned to bushranging in northeastern Victoria after escaping Melbourne's Pentridge prison. After this meeting, the Kellys formed part of Power's network of sympathisers, and by May 1869, Ned had become Power's bushranging protege. At the end of May, the prodigy and his mentor attempted to steal horses from the Mansfield property of squatter John Rowe, as a part of a larger plan to rob the Woods Point Mansfield gold escort. They would have to abandon this idea, however, fleeing back into the bush after Rowe shot at them. After this little hiccup, Kelly temporarily broke off his association with Power. Up until this point, Ned, despite his and his family's criminal doings, had managed to stay out of the police's way. That would change in mid-October 1869, however, when an altercation took place between him and a Chinese pig and fowl dealer from Morse's Creek named Ah Fook. And yes, I double checked that it was his actual name, Ah Fook. I know what it sounds like. According to Fook, as he passed the Kelly family home, Ned brandished a long stick and declared himself a bushranger before robbing him of 10 shillings. Despite this claim, Kelly gave evidence in court that Fook had abused his sister Annie in a dispute over Fook's request for a drink of water before beating Ned with a stick after he came to his sister's defense. Luckily for Ned, all charges against him would be dropped after Annie and 2 other family-related witnesses corroborated his side of the story. After a relatively quiet few months, Ned reconciled with his old friend Power in March 1870, and over the next month the pair committed a series of armed robberies as police scrambled to find them and identify Power's young accomplice. By the end of April, however, the press had named Kelly as the culprit, and a few days later he was captured by police and confined to Beechworth Jail. His trial ended up being quite a controversial one, with the first 2 charges being dismissed, as none of the victims could positively identify him. On the 3rd charge, the victims also reportedly failed to identify Kelly, possibly due to the fact that the witnesses had described Power's accomplice as a quote-unquote half-caste, or a person of mixed Aboriginal and European descent. The police, however, believed this was the result of Kelly going unwashed, and asked for him to be remanded for trial. Kelly was then sent to Melbourne, where he spent the weekend in a lock-up before being transferred to Kyneton to face court. No evidence was produced in court, however, and Kelly was released after a month. Soon after Kelly was released, his good friend Power was captured by a police search party while resting at a mountainside gunya or bark shelter that overlooked the property of Kelly's maternal grandfather, James Quinn. Following his arrest, word spread within the community that Kelly had informed on him, a rumour which Kelly adamantly denied. In a letter which bears the only surviving example of his handwriting, Kelly pleaded with Sergeant James Babington of Kyneton for help, saying that everyone looks on me like a black snake. The true informant actually turned out to be Kelly's uncle, Jack Lloyd, who received £500 for his assistance. In saying that, however, Kelly had also given information which led to Power's capture, and it is possible the charges against him were dropped in exchange for this information. Power also always believed that Kelly was responsible for the betrayal. You would think that this incredibly close call with the law would implore the young Ned Kelly to steer clear of criminal activity, but you would be wrong. In October 1870, Kelly was sentenced to 6 months of hard labour for assaulting a hawker named Jeremiah McCormack after an altercation between the man and one of Kelly's friends. Kelly was released from Beechworth Jail on the 27th of March 1871, 5 weeks early, and returned to Greta. 3 weeks later, horsebreaker Isaiah Wilde Wright arrived in town to see his friend Alex Gunn, a Scottish miner who had married Kelly's older sister. Wright was riding a chestnut horse which he had borrowed without telling the owner. Kelly later claimed that he was unaware that the horse didn't belong to Wright. According to Kelly's side of the story that ensued, the mare went missing that night, and Gunn lent Wright one of his own horses, promising that, if he found the horse, that he would keep it until Wright returned. Kelly said that as soon as Wright departed, the mare was found by Gunn and a neighbour. Kelly then took the mare to Wangaratta, where he stayed for 4 days. On the 20th of April, 1871, while riding back into Greta, Kelly was intercepted by Constable Edward Hall, who suspected the horse was stolen. Kelly was taken into custody with the help of 7 bystanders following a short but brutal altercation, in which Hall attempted to shoot Kelly and pistol-whipped him until his head became a mass of raw and bleeding flesh. Kelly and Gunn were both charged with horse stealing, but when it was later revealed that Kelly was still in Beechworth Jail when the horse was taken, the charges were downgraded to feloniously receiving a horse. Kelly and Gunn were sentenced to 3 years imprisonment with hard labour, and Wright, despite being the man who had actually stolen the horse, only received 18 months for illegal use of a horse. Kelly was released on the 2nd of February, 6 months early, for good behaviour. When he returned to Greta, his brother Jim was imprisoned for horse theft, and his mother soon married an American, George King. Following his release, to settle the score with Wright over the borrowed without consent horse, Kelly fought him in a bare-knuckle boxing match at the Imperial Hotel in Beechworth on the 8th of August 1874. Kelly won after 20 rounds and was declared the unofficial boxing champion of the district. In spite of his defeat, Wright actually greatly respected Kelly after this and became an ardent supporter of him. After the boxing match, things remained rather calm for Ned over the next few years, at least by his standards. In early 1877, he joined his stepfather in an organised horse-stealing operation, along with a few other men, most notably Joe Byrne, who will become a major player in the events to come. On the 18th of September 1877, Kelly was arrested in Benalla for riding over a footpath while drunk. The following day, he was involved in a brawl with 4 police officers who were escorting him to court. For this, Kelly was fined and released without further incident. In August 1877, Kelly, with his stepfather, George King, and their other accomplices, stole 11 horses from a paddock owned by James Whitty. Kelly then altered the brands of said horses and sold 6 of them to William Baumgarten, a horse dealer in Barnawartha, near the New South Wales border. On the 26th of September, the horses were listed as stolen and the police began an investigation. On the 10th of November, William Baumgarten and his brother Gustav were arrested for selling stolen horses, and the police were hot on Kelly's trail. A warrant for his arrest in relation to the Whitty larceny was sworn in March 1878, and a further warrant for the arrest of his younger brother Dan was issued on the 5th of April. On the 11th of April 1878, Constable Strachan, who was the officer in charge of Greta Police Station, heard that Kelly was at a shearing shed in New South Wales and was given leave to apprehend him. As a result of this, Kelly's old friend, Constable Fitzpatrick, who Kelly would claim held a grudge against him, due to Kelly knocking him down whilst he was trying to apprehend him, was ordered to Greta for relief duty. Before leaving for Greta, Fitzpatrick read in the Police Gazette of a warrant for Dan Kelly in relation to horse theft. Fitzpatrick then discussed with his sergeant at Benalla the idea of calling at the Kelly home on the way to Greta to arrest Dan. The sergeant agreed, but warned him to be careful, as the Kellys had acquired quite the reputation by this point. On the 15th of April, Fitzpatrick rode through Winton en route to Greta and stopped at the hotel there, where he had 1 brandy and lemonade, before making his way to the Kelly home. Finding Dan not present, Fitzpatrick remained with Kelly's mother in conversation for about an hour. 3 of the Kelly children were also present for this conversation. According to Fitzpatrick, at some point he heard someone chopping wood and went out to ensure that the chopping was licensed. Upon exiting the house, he found Brickley Williamson, a neighbour, who said that he didn't need a license because he was chopping wood on his own selection. Fitzpatrick then saw 2 horsemen making towards the Kelly house. The men proved to be the teenage Dan Kelly and his brother-in-law Bill Skillion. After seeing them, Fitzpatrick returned to the house and made the arrest. Dan asked to be allowed to have dinner before leaving, to which the constable consented. Minutes after this, Ned Kelly rushed in through the front door and fired a shot at Fitzpatrick with a revolver, but fortunately for the constable, missed him. Kelly's mother then hit Fitzpatrick over the head with a fire shovel, which was followed by a struggle in which Kelly fired 2 more shots, wounding Fitzpatrick just above his left wrist. During this intense struggle, Dan's friend Skillion and their neighbour Williamson entered the room, both armed with revolvers, and Dan subsequently managed to disarm Fitzpatrick. Ned apparently then told Fitzpatrick that he wouldn't have fired at him if he had known it was him. Fitzpatrick then fainted, and when he regained consciousness, Kelly compelled him to extract the bullet from his own arm with a knife, before Kelly's mother dressed the wound. Kelly then concocted a cover story, and said that if Fitzpatrick told his story, he would reward him after the Baumgarten case was over. Kelly's mother also somewhat threatened the constable by saying if he mentioned what really happened, that his life would be no good to him. Following this threat, Fitzpatrick was allowed to leave. He had ridden away about a mile when he found that 2 horsemen were pursuing him, but by spurring his horse into a gallop he escaped to the Winton Hotel and was assisted inside by the manager, where his wound was rebandaged and he was given a brandy and water. The manager then rode with him to Benalla, where he reported the affair to his superior officer. Now that is only the story according to Fitzpatrick. According to the Kellys, Ned was 200 miles from home at the time of the incident, and that when Fitzpatrick had entered the home, his mother had asked the constable if he had a warrant, but Fitzpatrick replied that he only had a telegram, to which his mother said that Dan need not go. According to Ned Kelly, Fitzpatrick then said, whilst pulling out a revolver, "I will blow your brains out if you interfere." His mother replied to this, "You would not be so handy with that pop gun of yours if Ned was here." Dan supposedly then said, trying to trick Fitzpatrick, "There is Ned coming along by the side of the house," while he was pretending to look out the window for Ned, before cornering Fitzpatrick, taking his revolver and allowing him to leave unharmed. If Fitzpatrick had suffered any wounds, according to Kelly they were possibly self-inflicted, and also Skillion and Williamson were not present. In 1879, Ned's sister, Kate, who was aged 14 at the time of the incident, stated that Kelly shot Fitzpatrick after the constable had made sexual advances towards her. Ned Kelly would later deny Fitzpatrick had tried to take liberties with Kate, however, stating that, "No, that is a foolish story. If he or any other policeman tried to take liberties with my sister, Victoria would not hold him." Regardless of what actually happened, Williamson, Skillion, and Ellen Kelly were arrested soon after and charged with aiding and abetting attempted murder, but Ned and Dan Kelly were nowhere to be found. Come the end of the trial, Ellen Kelly, Skillion, and Williamson were unsurprisingly convicted as accessories to the attempted murder of Fitzpatrick. Skillion and Williamson both received sentences of 6 years, and Ellen 3 years of hard labour, which was considered a harsh sentence even by people who held no sympathies towards the Kellys. After the Fitzpatrick incident, Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, and Joe Byrne went into hiding and were soon joined by Steve Hart, a friend of Dan. Not long after, the police received information that the Kelly gang were in the Wombat Ranges at the head of the King River. So, on the 25th of October, 1878, 2 mounted police parties consisting of 4 men in total were dispatched to search for them. After an unsuccessful first day of searching, on the following morning one of the parties went out scouting, while the other, made up of McIntyre and Lonigan, remained at the camp. At about 5 p.m, the 4 members of the Kelly gang emerged from the bush and ordered the 2 policemen in the camp to bail up and raise their arms. According to McIntyre, each member of the group was armed with a rifle, but according to Ned, they only had 2 guns. McIntyre was unarmed at the time and subsequently raised his arms. According to McIntyre, Lonigan then made a motion to draw his revolver and ran for the cover of a tree a few yards away, with Ned immediately shooting and killing him. According to Ned, Lonigan had ducked behind a fallen tree and Ned shot him as he raised his head to fire. Following this, the Kelly gang questioned McIntyre and armed themselves with the policeman's shotgun and revolvers. Half an hour later, at about 5:30 p.m, the second party, made up of Kennedy and Scanlon, returned on horseback and the Kelly gang hid themselves in the nearby brush. According to McIntyre, he walked towards Kennedy, but before he could speak to him, the Kelly gang ordered the police to bail up. Kennedy tried to unclip his gun and holster and shots were fired by the gang. McIntyre advised Kennedy to surrender as he was surrounded. Meanwhile, Scanlon dismounted and was shot while trying to unsling his rifle. McIntyre later recalled that Scanlon didn't have time to fire a shot, but, according to Ned, Scanlon fired and Ned shot him as he tried to fire again. Regardless, Scanlon died soon after. While this was happening, Kennedy had dismounted and, according to McIntyre, tried to surrender without firing a shot, but the gang continued firing at him. According to Kelly, Kennedy hid behind a tree and started firing before retreating into the bush, where Ned and Dan pursued him for almost a mile, exchanging gunfire with a sergeant before Ned shot him in the right side. According to Ned, Kennedy then turned around to face him and Ned shot him in the chest with his shotgun, not realizing that Kennedy had dropped his revolver and was turning to surrender. In the exchange of all this gunfire, McIntyre, who was still unarmed, mounted Kennedy's horse and was able to escape. He reached Mansfield Police Station the following day, and a search party quickly found the bodies of the fallen policemen. News of these killings led to widespread fear of the bushrangers, and on the 28th of October, the government of Victoria announced a reward of £800 for their arrest, which was soon increased to £2,000. On the 15th of November, the 4 members of the Kelly gang, having refused to surrender themselves, were declared outlaws. Now outlaws, on the run and in need of money, the Kelly gang planned to rob the bank in the small town of Euroa, which they did on the 9th of December. They emptied the safes and the cashier's drawers of cash and gold worth over £2,000. The 14 members of the bank's manager's household and staff were taken back to the Faithful's Creek homestead as hostages. There the gang performed some trick riding for the hostages, who now numbered 37 people, before leaving at around 8:30 p.m. Following the Euroa raid, the police presence in northeastern Victoria was expanded, and the reward for Kelly's capture was increased to £1,000. Despite the fact they had just robbed a bank, the Kelly gang were soon in need of funds once more, as they had distributed most of the proceeds from Euroa to family, friends, and associates who had given them assistance. So, in order to remedy this problem, they unsurprisingly decided they would rob another bank, this time in the town of Jerilderie. After learning more about the town and the police presence there via chatting with patrons and staff at a nearby inn, just after midnight on the morning of Sunday the 9th of February, the gang went to the town's police barracks under the pretext of alerting the police to a fictitious ball at Davidson's Inn. After confirming that there were only 2 policemen present, the gang drew their revolvers and bailed up the policemen. They secured the policemen in the lock-up near the main building and spent the night in the residential quarters of the police station, where they held one of the officers' wife and young children hostage. The Kelly gang spent most of Sunday preparing for the bank robbery and familiarising themselves with the small town's layout. At 10 a.m. the following day, Kelly and Byrne donned police uniforms, and the 4 outlaws took one of the hostage policemen, Richards, with them into town. They had left the other policeman, Devon, in the police lockup and had warned his wife that if she tried to leave the barracks, they would burn it down, with her and their young children inside. The gang then went into the main street of Jerilderie and held up the Royal Mail Hotel and the adjacent bank for over £2,000 in cash, as well as other valuables. After holding up the hotel, Ned went with 2 hostages to the newspaper owner's home, where he asked for copies of his famous Jerilderie letter to be published, which I will go into more detail on in a little bit, but found that the newspaper owner had earlier escaped capture at the bank and fled the town. After a detour to appraise a local famous racehorse, Ned then returned to the hotel and delivered a speech to the hostages, outlining his grievances against the police and the justice system, before telling the hostages, who now numbered about 30 people, that they were free to go. Shortly after this, the gang fled the town with their earnings, and Kelly and Hart were not seen again by the police for 17 months. As for that famous letter I promised I would go further into, prior to arriving in Jerilderie, Kelly wrote a lengthy letter with the aim of explaining his path to outlawry, justifying his actions, and outlining the alleged injustices his family had suffered at the hands of the police, and also attempted to invoke a tradition of Irish rebellion against what he called the tyrannism of the English yoke. This handwritten 56-page and 7,391-word document was described by Kelly as a bit of my life, and has been interpreted in many different ways. Some view it as a proto-Republican manifesto, whereas others see it as a murderous and maniacal rant and an insight into Kelly's grandiosity. The letter is noted for its unusual grammar and highlights Kelly's sense of humour. In probably the most famous passage, he calls the Victorian police a parcel of big, ugly, fat-necked, wombat-headed, big-bellied, magpie-legged, narrow-hipped, spalaw-footed sons of Irish bailiffs or English landlords. The infamous letter closes with the ominous, "Neglect this and abide by the consequences," which shall be worse than the rust in the wheat of Victoria or the drought of a dry season to the grasshoppers in New South Wales. I do not wish to give the order full force without giving timely warning, but I am a widow's son, outlawed, and my orders must be obeyed. During the Kelly outbreak and after the Jerilderie raid, police watch parties began monitoring houses belonging to relatives of the gang in hopes of acquiring more information or even catching some of the Kelly gang members themselves. The police primarily used the house of Joe Byrne's mother's neighbour, Aaron Sherritt, a former Greeter member and a lifelong friend of Joe Byrne, as a base of operations. On top of this, Sherritt also accepted police payments for camping with the watch parties and for providing information on the bushrangers' activities, although it is likely that he gave the police some false information in order to protect his friend Byrne. In March 1879, Byrne's mother discovered Sherritt with a police surveillance group and later denounced him as a spy. In the following months, Byrne and Ned sent Sherritt messages stating that the Lloyds and Quinns wanted him shot, and that it would be better for him if he joined the outlaws, perhaps in the hope that their friend would see the error of his ways and return to them. However, he would not, and after continuing his relationship with the police, Joe Byrne warned Sherritt's mother that the outlaws were going to kill him. Soon after, the gang finally decided that they would murder Sherritt as a part of their own plan, one that they boasted would astonish not only the Australian colonies but the whole world. On the 26th of June 1880, Dan and Byrne rode into the Woolshed Valley and kidnapped Anton Wick, who lived near Sherritt, before forcing him to come with them to Sherritt's hut, which was occupied by Sherritt, his pregnant wife Ellen and her mother, as well as 4 policemen who had been stationed in the hut to guard Sherritt and spy on Byrne's mother's home. At about 6:30 p.m, under the cover of darkness, Dan went to the front door of the hut, while Byrne forced Wick to knock on the back door and call out for Sherritt. When Sherritt answered the door, Byrne subsequently shot him in the throat and chest with a shotgun, killing him. Byrne then entered the hut, letting Dan in, while the 4 policemen hid in the bedroom. Byrne then heard the police scrambling for their shotguns and demanded that they come out. When the police didn't respond, he fired into the bedroom before sending the pregnant, now widowed, Ellen into the bedroom to bring out the police, but unfortunately for Byrne, the police held her in the room. The outlaws then left the hut, whilst loudly threatening to burn those inside alive. After a failed attempt to set fire to the building, the outlaws stayed outside, yelling threats at the occupants before releasing Wick and riding away after the 2-hour-long siege. The terrified policemen didn't end up leaving the hut until the following morning, however, for fear that the bushrangers would still be waiting outside for them. Now that the policemen were free, the gang estimated that the news of Sherritt's murder would reach Beechworth by early Sunday morning, prompting a special police train to be sent up from Melbourne. They also managed to predict that the train would collect reinforcements in Benalla before continuing through Glenrowan, a small town in the Warby Ranges. There, the gang planned to pull off their biggest hit against the police yet, by derailing the train and shooting dead any survivors, when they would then ride to an unpoliced Benalla and subsequently rob the banks, set fire to the courthouse, blow up the police barracks, release anyone imprisoned in the jail, and generally play havoc with the entire town, before returning to the relative safety of the bush. In order to derail the train, Ned and Hart tried but failed to damage the track at Glenrowan, but being unable to do so, forced 2 local plate layers and some labourers camped nearby to finish the job. The outlaws didn't merely pick any spot on the track, however. They specifically chose a line that ran across a deep ravine and told their captives that they were going to send the train and its occupants to hell. After the train track was successfully damaged, Byrne and Dan arrived at Glenrowan, and with the help of the other gang members, took over the railway station, the station masters, and Anne Jones' homes, as well as the Glenrowan Inn. The gang used the hotel to hold the workers and any other male prisoners that gathered throughout the night and the following day. However, most of the women and children taken prisoner were held at the station master's home. The other hotel in town, McDonald's Railway Hotel, located on the opposite side of the tracks, was used to stable the gang's stolen horses, one of which carried a tin of blasting powder and fuses. The pack horses also carried suits of the famous bullet-repelling armour the gang would come to be known for, complete with a helmet and weighing about 44 kilos in total. The armour was specifically designed to provide protection as the outlaws stood on top of the embankment firing down on any survivors of the train wreck. It is noteworthy there was no leg armour, as would hinder the outlaws' movement and wasn't necessary given the angle of any return fire up the embankment. By Sunday afternoon, the expected train had still not arrived, so the outlaws moved most of the women and children to the Glenrowan Inn, where there were now 62 hostages, including sympathisers, who the gang had planted to help control the situation. As the hours continued to pass without any sight of the train, the gang provided the hostages with alcohol and organised music, singing, dancing, and games. One hostage would later say that Ned did not treat us badly, not at all. In saying that though, during this time, Ned did threaten to shoot another young hostage, keeping the boy in a state of extreme terror for about half an hour. During the late afternoon and evening of Sunday, Ned allowed 21 of the hostages, who he considered trustworthy, to leave. At about 10 p.m, Ned and Byrne captured Glenrowan's lone constable, Hugh Bracken, with the assistance of hostage Thomas Curnow, a local schoolmaster who sought to gain the gang's trust in order to thwart their plans. Sometime after this, believing that Curnow was a genuine sympathiser, Ned let him and his wife return to their home close to the railway tracks, but warned them to go quietly to bed and not to dream too loud. It would turn out that the train that had been expecting hours earlier would only leave Benalla at 2 a.m. on Monday. The train carried 7 regular troopers under Superintendent Hare, 5 Queensland Aboriginal troopers under Sub-Inspector O'Connor, 4 journalists, and several other civilians. Acting on intelligence that the tracks had been sabotaged, Hare had ordered a pilot engine to travel ahead of the police train. At 2:30 a.m, the pilot train was finally approaching Glenrowan when Curnow went to the tracks, signalled it to stop, and alerted the driver of the danger. Elsewhere, Kelly had decided it was time to let the hostages return home, and was delivering them one final lecture about police informers when Byrne came in from outside with the news that a train had arrived. The outlaws then donned their armour and prepared themselves for a confrontation. Meanwhile, Constable Bracken told the hostages to lie low, and escaped to the railway station to explain the situation to the police. Upon hearing Bracken's report, Hare immediately led a detachment of police towards the hotel, while the main body of troopers prepared horses and equipment just after 3 a.m. In preparation for the attack, the 4 outlaws positioned themselves in the shadow of the veranda in the front of the hotel and began firing when the police were about 30 metres away in the moonlight. The police subsequently returned fire, and about 100 to 150 shots were fired in 15 minutes. During the intense firing, someone shouted that there were women and children in the building, and there was a lull in the shooting. During the exchange of gunfire, Superintendent Hare was wounded in the left wrist, and soon had to return to Benalla for treatment. Ned was also wounded in the left hand and arm, as well as his right foot. Byrne, as well, was shot in the leg and retreated into the hotel. 2 innocent hostages were also fatally wounded by the police fire through the thin weatherboard walls of the building, one of them being 13-year-old John Jones, and the other a railway worker named Martin Cherry. A third hostage, George Metcalf, was also fatally wounded, either by the police fire or by accidentally being shot by Ned in an earlier incident. During this lull in the firing, a number of hostages, mostly women and children, fortunately managed to escape from the hotel. At this point, Kelly was bleeding heavily from his wounds and retreated behind the hotel and made his way into the bush, where police found his skull cap and rifle at around 3:30 a.m, about 90 metres from the hotel. Kelly later stated that at the time he was in the bushes and not far from the police. The police would surround the hotel throughout the night after the gang retreated, and the firing continued intermittently. At about 5 a.m, Joe Byrne was fatally shot in the groin while making a toast to the Kelly gang in the bar. Shortly after this, between 5:30 and 7 a.m, police reinforcements under Sergeant Steele and Superintendent Sadler arrived from Wangaratta and Benalla, bringing the total number of police present to about 40. Seriously wounded, yet still not found, Kelly laid in the bush for most of the night before, at 7 a.m, dressed in his armour and armed with 3 handguns, he emerged from the bush and attacked the police from the rear. Eyewitnesses variously compared the figure moving in the early morning mist to a bunyip, the devil, or a ghost. He was no ghost, however, and police returned fire as Kelly moved towards the hotel, now staggering from his injuries, combined with the weight of his armour and the impact of bullets on the plate iron, which he later described as like blows from a man's fist. Kelly continued firing, however, even through the difficulty and pain of aiming, firing, and reloading his weapons due to his injuries and limited vision through his helmet. The gun battle with Ned lasted under half an hour until Steele brought him down with 2 shotgun blasts to his unprotected legs and thighs. Ned was then disarmed and carried to the railway station where a doctor attended to his injuries. He was later found to have more than 28 wounds, including serious gunshot wounds to his left elbow and right foot. In the meantime, the siege continued, with Ned's brother Dan and Steve Hart still inside. At around 10 AM, a ceasefire was called, and the remaining 30 hostages left the hotel. By Monday afternoon, a crowd of some 600 spectators had gathered at Glenrowan, and Dan and Hart had ceased shooting. Unwilling to allow his men to storm the hotel, Sadler ordered a cannon to be sent to blast out the outlaws, but then decided to burn them out. At 2:50 PM, Senior Constable Charles Johnson, supported by covering fire from the police, set fire to the Glenrowan Inn. Matthew Givney, a Catholic priest, entered the burning building sometime after in an attempt to rescue anyone inside, and discovered the bodies of Byrne, Dan, and Hart. The exact manner of Dan and Hart's deaths are unknown, however it seems they likely committed suicide together in order to avoid burning alive. Sadly, Dan Kelly had just turned 19 at the time, and Steve Hart was 21. This brought the ultimate death toll of the siege to 3 members of the Kelly gang and 3 hostages, with Ned being the only Kelly gang member to survive the siege. Ned Kelly, after adequately recovering, stood trial on the 19th of October 1880 in Melbourne before Sir Redmond Barry, the same judge who had earlier sentenced his mother to 3 years hard labour. The trial would eventually be adjourned to the 28th of October, where Kelly was convicted of the willful murder of Constable Lonigan and sentenced to death by hanging. The judge concluded with the customary words, "May God have mercy on your soul," to which Kelly replied, "I will go a little further than that, and say I will see you there where I go." Somewhat creepily, Barry died of natural causes only 12 days after Kelly's execution. Speaking of which, would be carried out on the 11th of November, after an unsuccessful petition for clemency containing some 32,000 signatures was presented to the governor's private secretary on the 8th of November. The day before his execution, Kelly had his photographic portrait taken as a keepsake for his family, and he was granted farewell interviews with relatives. One newspaper reported that his mother's last words to him were, "Mind you die like a Kelly." The following morning, John Castow, the governor of the jail, informed Kelly that the hour of execution had been fixed at 10 AM. Kelly's leg irons were soon removed, and at 9 AM he was let out by warders, accompanied by chaplain Dean Donaghy. When passing the jail's garden, he commented on the beauty of the flowers. Soon after this, Kelly was taken to the gallows and hanged. Accounts differ about his last words, with some newspapers reporting they were, "Such is life," while other newspapers wrote that they were, "Ah, well, I suppose it has come to this," as the rope was placed around his neck. The actual warden, though, later wrote that Kelly, when prompted to say his last words, mumbled something indiscernible. Regardless of his last words, though, he was now dead, and thus ending the incredible story of his life. Well, that's where this entire series is going to end. If you've watched all 3 parts, thank you so much. I know they haven't been the most popular videos on my channel, but hey, who really cares? I enjoyed making them. If you enjoyed watching them, please don't forget to leave a like, and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me. But, with all that being said, and as always, I hope you guys have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you in the next one.